Hello and welcome to TV on TV. Today is Thursday, October 7th. I'm State Representative Tommy Vitolo, and you're watching Brookline Interactive Group. We have got a great show for you today. We're going to talk with Town Clerk Ben Kaufman about how it's been going in his new gig. He's been the town clerk since May, but more importantly, how redistricting and re-precincting are going. That's when the district lines and the precinct lines are drawn once a decade. We're going to get into it. It's really interesting stuff. And it has real practical implications for voters and our government. But first, the news. On Monday, Facebook and its platforms, including Instagram and WhatsApp, experienced worldwide outages, leaving users who rely on these platforms without service for 6 hours. Reportedly, some people talked to each other face to face or even went outside. With the federal government projected to default on its debt in the next 2 weeks, Democrats in the United States Senate are searching for ways to raise the debt limit, including ending the filibuster rule. The Biden administration has proposed restoring provisions in the National Environmental Policy Act that were rolled back during the Trump administration. NEPA regulates how pipelines, highways, and other projects are reviewed. Yesterday, the Massachusetts House of Representatives passed legislation that clarifies a 2016 ballot question regulating hen cage space. The legislation updates confined cruelty standards for multi-tiered structures, expands coverage for all hens, and clarifies the existing exemption of combined hens to 24 hours within a 30-day period. Importantly, these tweaks harmonized Massachusetts law with the law of many surrounding states, allowing for really ease in interstate commerce, particularly amongst eggs. Metropolitan Council for Educational Opportunity, known as METCO, opened its new headquarters in Nubian Square this week. Brookline has been an active member of the voluntary school busing program since its inception in 1966. Kara Bruton was named Brookline's latest Director of Planning and Community Development. Bruton has served the town as Economic Development Director since 2008. Keep an eye out for road closures on Monday as the Boston Marathon wends through town all along Beacon Street. And without further ado, I'm looking forward to cutting over to our interview with Ben Kaufman, recorded yesterday. Again, we're going to look at redistricting and re-precincting. So stay tuned, and thanks for watching Brookline Interactive Group. And as promised, today we've got Town Clerk Ben Kaufman. And we're going to check in on Ben and see how things are going. But really, we want to know what's going on with the maps. We want to know about redistricting. We want to know about re-precincting. We want to know about what that political map looks like for the next 10 years. So Clerk Kaufman, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you for having me on, Representative.
It's, I'll tell you what, I'll make a deal. I'll call you Ben, you call me Tommy, just like the good old days.
Sounds good with me. All
right. So the rest of you, though, he's Clerk Kaufman. So anyway, Ben, you've been in office since mid-May, and I know you inherited an office that, for a variety of reasons, had some dust on the shelves, had some old ways of doing things that maybe weren't as efficient, maybe weren't even compliant. Tell us how the last few months have been just ramping up into the job.
It's been a lot of fun and a lot of learning as I've come in. I'm incredibly lucky to have a really phenomenal staff who I got to come in and work with. They know their stuff, they have ideas, they're passionate and engaged and working really hard. So coming into a situation like that has been really great, and I feel very lucky to have that. A lot of the work we've been doing internally is getting things up to date, modernizing some of the systems that we have, and working to implement some better internal processes that hopefully will have better outcomes for the public and for those who come and interact with our office. So it's been a lot of learning, a lot of new adventures every day, but it's been really great coming into this office and trying to make some change.
So I think that the town clerk's office is in many ways a primary interface with the public. But I suspect different members of the public interface with the clerk's office in very different ways and are totally unaware of the other ways in which the public interfaces. So could you maybe not a comprehensive list, but give us a sense of all the different ways in which your office interfaces with the public? What are the things you handle and how does that work?
Absolutely. So a lot of people interact with our office through elections, whether it's coming in to register to vote, updating their information, or actually coming on election day and voting. We haven't had an election day since I got here, but that still means every day we have new voter registrations coming in. We actually did a table for National Voter Registration Day a couple weeks back to get new voters engaged and involved in Brookline, which has been a lot of fun. The other big thing that we interact with a lot is people coming in for vital records and vital documents. Sometimes it's people coming in to get a birth certificate because they're trying to get their new real ID from the state. Sometimes it's somebody coming in to file a marriage intention because they're ready to get married. And sometimes it's people coming in to get a dog license because they want to make sure their dog can go off leash in one of our dog parks. So it's really a mix of people who come in. And then the other group, which we're having a lot of people right now, are people who are interacting with the government, people who are interacting with town meeting, with the select board, with other boards and commissions, come to our office for help, for assistance, to ask questions, to learn more about how they can be involved in town government and opportunities we have to point people in the right direction and help them be engaged. Really excellent chances to work with people.
And of course, people come in to register to vote.
Absolutely.
That's a thing worth doing, right? You know,
we have a lot of people coming in, and especially as we get to the May election that we have coming up, having more people get registered, get engaged, so that they understand the impact they can have on Brookline and in local government is going to be really, really important. Your vote in local government is impactful on all kinds of different stuff, your garbage, your schools, your roads, all of that's done by local government. So the more people can show up on election day and vote for their local elected representatives, the better. So we like registering people to vote, and we're going to plan on going around and having tables not only at town hall, but also in the community to get more people engaged.
That's great. Love to hear about all of that stuff. But the thing that I'm most interested in right now, because it's topical and it's somewhere in between Groundhog's Day and Haley's Comet, it comes once every 10 years, is map making, specifically redistricting, re-precincting. Give us a sense for what's going on, why it's happening now. Give us the lay of the land here.
Sure. So every 10 years, the census occurs in the United States. They count every single person in the country, regardless of their immigration status, their race, ethnicity, whether they're experiencing homelessness or experiencing incarceration. Every single person gets counted every 10 years. And that number is used to draw a bunch of different lines around our elected offices. At the state, they do redistricting, where they draw new district lines. Here in Brookline, we do re-precincting, where we draw new precinct lines using the new census numbers. So the data came out from the census back in August, saying that our total census number was about 63,191. And we are now going to look at those census blocks and draw new lines to create new precincts for the town.
All right, so I've got a lot of vocabulary questions. Many folks are used to using these words. Some folks are not. Let's start with what's a census block and then tell us what's a precinct.
Sure. So the census block is the smallest unit that the census uses to calculate population. It's usually bound by a fixed geographic structure. So in Brookline, a lot of them are bound by roads or paths or train tracks. They can also be bound by power lines or streams and rivers, as well as by the boundaries of a town itself. And each block in that one contained feature will have a number of people who live there. And that's the smallest building block that we use when we start to build our precincts. And a precinct is a geographic area that determines where people vote, and in the case of Brookline, who people vote for offices such as town meeting, state representative, and depending on how lines are drawn, different precincts could also vote for other offices in different ways from the rest of the town. So many people don't know their precinct, but they might know where they go and they vote. So for example, if you're somebody who votes right now at the senior center on Winchester Street, you live in precinct 9, which is my precinct. And those lines might change. So people might experience a different polling location, or perhaps might have a different town meeting member representing them than what they have right now.
So I hear you when you say that, your precinct might change, but why? Why change precincts at all?
So state law lays out a number of requirements for precincts, and the one that's most important for us is population. So each precinct must be within 5% of all of the other precincts in town in terms of the number of people who are in them. And that's to try to maintain fairness across the entire town. And also each precinct is capped at 4,000 people. A precinct cannot have more than 4,000 people in it. So when the census came out and we tallied up all of the numbers, there are some precincts in Brookline that are too small. They're more than 5% below the average, so they need to grow a little bit. And there are some precincts that are too large, some precincts that are over 4,000 people, and those need to shrink a little bit so that we can bring back to a fairly even number of people in each precinct.
Now, doing some quick math here and knowing that there are 16 precincts currently, if each precinct had the maximum of 4,000 people, that would allow for a town of 64,000. And you said that our town was 63,191, which is awfully close to 64,000. So what do we do if the balloon pops? How do we handle this?
So you're correct. 63,191 people divided by 16 precincts is 3,950 in each precinct, which is quite close to 4,000. Can make the math sometimes when looking at a precinct line a little bit difficult. And Brookline is allowed to add precincts if they want to. You are allowed to add as many as you want, and there are different implications that happen when they do. So there is a committee that is currently looking at re-precincting in Brookline. It's a committee that is appointed by the select board and will ultimately advise and submit recommendations to the select board for the select board's ultimate vote on a precinct map. And it's possible that that committee will look at 16 precincts, 17 precincts, 18 precincts, all the way up to 20 precincts to decide if there is a way that they want to change the map to accommodate some of the increased population and try to avoid hitting that 4,000 person threshold.
So you mentioned that there are these atomic blocks, these census blocks, right? Which is just mostly the smallest amount of land that you can walk around on a road, right? And then we assemble these together to make precincts, and the town has 16 precincts, and they have to be less than 4,000. They all have to be about the same size. Are there any other requirements, rules about how we draw the precincts that are sort of cut and dried, where anybody could look at it and say that breaks the rule or that is consistent with the rule?
So the most cut and dry rule is that a precinct must be contiguous. It has to have every piece in contact with every other piece. So you couldn't draw a precinct that has one census block in Washington Square and one census block in Coolidge Corner and one census block down by Putterham and say that's a precinct because it's not contiguous. So that's a fairly cut and dry one. There are other things that we consider when we're drawing a precinct, such as it being compact, and you want it to be as compact as possible. And then we also do consider racial and ethnic diversity within a precinct. We want to make sure that we are not packing everybody from a certain group into one precinct to reduce their voting power, and similarly, that we're not splitting up a population into several different precincts to dilute their power. So those are all things that we keep in mind and will consider while the maps are being drawn.
So those are specific topics that are covered in the law, right? The law, the state law in some cases, federal law is very clear. Even if the packing or the compactness leaves some judgment or some eye of the beholder, it's clearly there as a consideration. Are there other considerations that this committee is thinking about that are optional, you're allowed to think about these things, not required to, right? Are there other criteria which this committee is trying to be sensitive to?
So this has been a big point of conversation within the committee, is what other considerations they want to factor in while they are drawing these lines. And a lot of the conversations have been revolving around things like walkability, both within the precinct and also from the houses in the precinct to a potential polling location. Some of the conversations have been about keeping other communities together, not necessarily racial or ethnic communities, but communities that have similar interests, represent a similar neighborhood, come from a similar background, and want to have a similar advocate, and whether we want to include those communities in our calculations while drawing a new precinct map. And another calculation that always happens is the census block says the total number of residents, but it does not say the total number of voters. So there's a consideration of drawing a map that factors in where the voters are living, where voter turnout is happening, and how we can make sure that that is also accounted for in the calculations. So these are all things that the committee is discussing and talking about, and going to be prioritizing some over others while they're going through this process.
I'm going to take the bait on voters and ask you to sort of explore that a little more. I could imagine several different things when we say a voter. One definition of voter might be a person who is legally entitled to register to vote or not. So, for example, people who are not US citizens, people who are under 18, people who were convicted of an election fraud felony and therefore will never be allowed to vote again, right? These are all people who, even if they want to tomorrow, would not be legally allowed to vote. But another definition of voter might be, well, there are folks who tend to vote, and there are folks who tend to not vote, even though they could. And so when you're talking about voters in a precinct, what do you mean?
So you hit a really excellent point that a lot of committee members have talked about and had some conversations about. The main way that it's been broken down in the committee is 3 categories of voters. So one category is eligible voters. So this is anybody who would be eligible to come and vote as long as they register ahead of time. One is actual registered voters, the number of people who have registered and are currently voters within our voter registration system. And the third category is active voters. And there are different ways to consider a voter to be an active voter. And that could be that they vote at every election, that they vote at frequent elections, or they voted in a certain number of elections over a certain period of time. So all of those are different ways to think about voting populations and how we would consider voters when drawing a precinct line that the committee will be talking about.
I will take the bait and editorialize a little bit. If you spread out the active voters amongst the precincts, you might be serving to crack the inactive voters by, spreading them throughout different precincts so they don't have as much power. Whereas all of the inactive voters are in one precinct, well, then maybe they'd even have more power. Unclear. Something to think about, or maybe something to not care about at all. The law certainly doesn't require the committee to care about it. Are there other considerations? Are there other considerations that the committee is thinking through? You mentioned communities that are interesting as opposed to communities of interest, right? Not ones that the law mandates, but other groups that might be interesting. You mentioned walkability. Well, let me ask you this question. Walkability to what? Is there a fixed list of polling locations, or how do we even know who decides what's a polling location, or what makes a good polling location, or might those change? Is there some flexibility with polling locations?
So polling locations has definitely been a big conversation within the committee. I think there is a general agreement that people want voters to be able to get to their polling location easily. So there are some legal criteria for polling locations. They must be accessible. They must be of a certain size in order to accommodate the machines that we have in there. And also they must be within Brookline. You cannot have a polling location for a Brookline precinct in Boston, for example. And one of the things that the town clerk's office has been working on is gathering a list of polling locations that could be used. The decision on actually placing a polling location is up to the select board with advice from the town clerk's office. And the select board tends to rely heavily on the town clerk to provide input and feedback on a potential polling location. So there are many that we currently use that will probably still be used in the future. A lot of schools are really excellent examples of polling locations that could host more than one precinct because they have a large gym with enough space to have multiple precincts. And then there are some new places that might be coming online, whether they be town-owned buildings, which we prefer because we know we control the building, we know we have access to it, we know that we'll be able to use it on election day, as well as some privately owned buildings. Right now in Brookline, we do use one non-town owned building as a polling location, the Wheelock College, which is owned by BU for Precinct 1. But there are also conversations about various churches, temples, private schools, and other privately held places that could be potential polling locations once we get to the next election.
So we thought through polling locations a little bit, and we talked about sort of some of the factors for drawing a map. What's the timeline on these maps? How quickly is all of this happening?
So this year, the timeline is different than it's been in a lot of past years, and that's largely due to COVID. In a normal census year, we would get data in the spring, be able to discuss it throughout the spring, and have the precinct maps submitted by June, which then allows the state to build state legislative districts and federal legislative districts using individual precincts. This year, because of COVID, the data came out much later. So in order to allow the work of both municipalities drawing a new precinct and of the state drawing legislative districts, the legislature recently passed a bill that I'm sure Dr. Vitolo can speak more in depth about that would change that timeline. So under that bill, the deadline for for Brookline to submit their maps to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts would be 4 weeks after the day that the legislature approves their district level maps. And that gives a little bit of time for Brookline to look at a map from the state and decide if we want to draw a precinct that follows a state line or if we want to draw precincts that don't.
What kind of state lines would show up on a town voting map? I'm not making the connection.
Sure. So when a state legislative district is drawn, they also have a number of people that's kind of set. They need to be within a certain number. So right now, a state rep seat is going to be around 43,000 people. And in Brookline, because we have more than 43,000 people, it's guaranteed that we are going to have more than one state representative seat in Brookline. Currently, we actually have 4 state representatives in Brookline. So where that line is drawn could determine which voters would vote for which state representative seat. So having those lines follow a precinct line can have benefits, but it is going to be ultimately up to the committee whether they want to have the precinct lines follow the state rep lines, or if they want to go ahead and draw the precinct lines how they want and ignore what's happening with the state rep lines.
So the committee, they've got time after the state legislature draws the state lines, which is United States Congress, state Senate, and state rep. There's no reason to think that Brookline will be divided into more than one congressional seat or state Senate seat. It's theoretically possible. It isn't the case now. There's no reason to think it would be the case. But certainly we will have more than one state representative because that's math, as you pointed out. And boy, it's nice to have town clerks who can do arithmetic. That's, you count the votes, good you can add. That's expected, and the alternative would be worse. And the committee's going to have you said a month before it's due, but the committee doesn't the committee, you said at the beginning, makes a recommendation. So sort of after the committee's drawn its map, sometime probably after the state has drawn its map, what happens next?
Sure. So the committee is appointed by the select board, and its job is to make recommendations to the select board for the map. So it would be expected that the committee would submit one, two, as many maps as they feel they would like to submit to the select board as suggestions for what a final precinct map should be. And then it's up to the select board to actually vote on what that map is. And they can vote on a map that comes from the committee. They can vote on a map that comes from the committee with a couple of tweaks and changes, or they could vote on an entirely different map that has nothing to do with what the committee did. So there will be a time later when we get up to the deadline of 30 days after the state legislature maps, where the select board is going to have a meeting and they're going to discuss the maps that have come out of this committee and decide if they want to go with those or if they want to tweak something or go with something entirely different. And ultimately that decision will be up to the select board.
So we've only got a few minutes left, but I do have what I think is a really important question. So it seems clear that the current 16 precincts cannot remain exactly as they are. Some have more than 4,000 people in them, and that's against the law. Lines have to move. So two-part question. Number one, what happens to a voter if their precinct is changed? Number two, what happens to the town meeting members in the next election if their precinct changes? Even just a little bit.
So those are both excellent questions. And the voter question is probably the one that people will experience the most. So if your precinct changes, if a line moves and you used to be in precinct 10 and now you're in precinct 11, then it is very likely it would happen that your polling location would change, your town meeting members would change, and a lot of things would be changing. The town clerk's office is going to be doing a series of both legally required information, but also other information we want to get out there to make sure people know about these changes. So we will be posting in precincts where new polling locations are going to be, and we will be having a large effort to inform voters of changes that might be happening. And that will include everything right up to on election day, making sure we're able to tell people who show up at their old polling location, no, you are now at a new polling location, and make sure that they get to the right place. The question about town meeting members is very interesting and somewhat unique to Brookline. The number of town meeting members is actually determined by a calculation based on the number of precincts that we have. So if they change the number of precincts, it's actually possible we change the number of town meeting members we have serving. And that could be have some interesting implications, and that's one of the big things that the committee is discussing. Any line that changes anywhere, even if we stay at 16 precincts, would have an impact in town meeting. State law requires that if there's even the smallest tweak to the precinct lines, say it moves over one street or even moves over one alley, then every town meeting member in that precinct would need to run again for their seat. And when that happens, there are 15 town meeting members currently in each precinct. It'll be broken down into 1/3, 1/3, and 1/3. The top 1/3 of winners would be elected to a 3-year term. The next 1/3 of winners would be elected to a 2-year term. And the third group of winners would be elected to a 1-year term, and we need to run again the following year. So there's a chance that there could be some disruption within town meeting. It's a chance that you might have some town meeting members move into a new precinct, perhaps move into a precinct where there are already 15 existing town meeting members, and they might have to run against other incumbents for their seat. But if any precinct line changes, every town meeting member in that precinct will have to run again in the May 2022 election.
This is fascinating. There's so many details. We don't have time to talk about any more. The committee that is working on this meets every Thursday at 7 p.m. You can go to the town calendar, find out the Zoom login, and they're open to the public, at the very least to listen, if not to have the opportunity to speak. And I encourage viewers to check it out and to pay attention over the next 4 to 6 weeks, perhaps a bit longer, as these boundaries are drawn. Clerk Kaufman, thank you so much for spending some time with us this Thursday, and delighted that you're enjoying yourself and doing such great work, and delighted that the good folks watching here on Brookline Interactive Group had the opportunity to hear from you. So we'll see you soon.
Thank you so much, Tommy.